Breakfast with Brodies. This is an introduction to infrastructure projects and construction. I'm Stuart Murray. I'm a senior associate in the infrastructure projects team here at Brodies, and you're all very welcome this morning. It's a little overview about what we're going to talk about. I thought it would be helpful to talk about how I got to where I am as a sort of starter for 10, and then get into the detail of infrastructure projects and construction. I'm going to take you through what makes a project. I think it's something that a lot of people don't really understand because it's not something that you get at university as part of the LLB or as the diploma. I'll talk about who we work for, which is quite important, who are our clients. I'll talk a little bit about what we do. I think a lot of the time when lawyers talk about what they do, they tend to describe the work that their clients are doing rather than the work that they are doing for their clients. So I think that'll be quite helpful. We can chat through a couple of example projects just to give you a flavour of the sorts of things that we work on. I'll touch upon what junior members of the team get up to in our gang, and then I'll take you very quickly through a short case study about the vaccine centres, which is something that we did recently, and then there'll be time at the end for any questions. So this is Breakfast with Brodies. It's part of a series that Brodies run for you guys. You can check out the website for more details on what's involved in the programme and what's coming up. I think there's been one already. This is the second one. They're dead helpful. They're probably all experts in their field and talking to you sensibly about what we do. So it's definitely worthwhile getting involved and getting stuck into the rest of the programme. I've already mentioned that I'm Stuart Murray. I'm a senior associate in the projects team. The projects team sits in part of the overall projects team in Brodies, which includes oil and gas, energy, infrastructure and construction. And we sit in our little infrastructure part of that as part of the wider team, and projects sits within the commercial and corporate gang at Brodies. You guys should hopefully be a mix of law students, trainees and NQs, and because it's open to anybody, it could be a whole bunch of other people. So if you're somebody other than that, you can let me know in the chat. And just to let you know, we are actually hiring at the moment for an NQ solicitor into our infrastructure projects team. So there's details of all of our NQ vacancies this year, of which there are many, on our website. So definitely worth giving that a look after the presentation. You might have seen in Brodie's social media posts that we have this concept of no wrong path, and I'm definitely, I think, the definition of no wrong path. You might be wondering why there's a picture of wine bottles and hospital on the screen. It's not because I drank too much wine and went to hospital. It's because I used to be a wine buyer for a Scottish independent wine retailer. I retrained as a lawyer as a graduate on the LLB at Strathclyde and did the diploma at Strathclyde and did my traineeship at McGregor's, as it was before it merged with Pinsent's. My first seat at McGregor's was in infrastructure projects, which I had never heard of before and had no idea what was involved. I did 6 months in infrastructure projects working on all of this stuff, and then went on to do corporate. I did a secondment at Standard Life in their litigation team, and then my last seat was what we called at the time construction procurement. And at the end of all that, I was offered a job in corporate and projects, and I took the projects job. And here I am now, 10 years later, having left Pinsent's 3 years ago to join Brodies and get going with the projects team here. That's kind of my journey. And that's actually a picture of Gloucestershire Royal Hospital, which we are currently working on. I think that's the new emergency department, which we did the contracts for last year. So wine bottles to hospitals, good. Projects are quite odd things because they are not one set thing, but what they are at their very heart is a public authority procuring a service from a place. And if we think about that with a live example, you think about a hospital. Not all NHS boards or trusts build hospitals that they pay for themselves and then put staff in and pay the staff to run. What some did in the late 90s and early noughties was they created what are called private finance initiative projects, whereby what the public authority actually bought was the service, not the building. And in order for somebody to provide the service, they obviously had to have a building to provide it out of. And so they themselves built the building in order to provide the service. That sounds really odd, but it'll become clear when we get into this in a bit more detail. Effectively, what happens is that a service provider plus a construction contractor plus a whole bunch of investors come together to agree to build a hospital on behalf of an NHS trust or board, with a view to providing a serviced asset, effectively the hospital in this instance, for a period of time for the procuring authority, in this case the NHS. And to do that, they borrow money from a bank, and they employ a contractor to build the hospital, and they pay the contractor with the money they borrowed from the bank. And as soon as the hospital opens and services are delivered out of that hospital, the NHS starts paying for those services. And the price of those services includes the repayment of the loan. So it's a bit like buying a house. In order to buy a house, unless you're very rich, which the NHS is not, you have to get a loan to buy it. And in the case of projects in PFI and PPP, the person who gets the loan is not the public authority, it's the person building the property who is then going to provide the service out of the property. That all happens around assets that services are provided out of. They're not all buildings. It can be things like roads. So you can borrow money from a bank to build a road, and then you get paid to service the road over the period it takes you to pay back the bank. You also make some money out of that yourself if you're the private sector. And if you're the public sector, you get an asset that somebody else looks after on your behalf that you haven't had to pay for up front. And that has huge benefits, or it had huge benefits or perceived benefits for balance sheet treatment of these projects, because you didn't have to account for them up front. You only had to account for your annual service charge for the asset. So hopefully that kind of describes in pretty broad world what makes a project and not a construction project. If you think about two hospitals in Scotland, one of them is the Royal Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital and the other one is the Glasgow Southern General Hospital. Glasgow Southern General Hospital was bought by the NHS. They paid a contractor to build that hospital. And at the end of it all, they then employ somebody to run the hospital for them. The Royal Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital, they did not pay for upfront. They are now paying for during services. That's the kind of main difference between what a project is, a PPP project, and what a construction project is. So the sorts of people that we work for, you can kind of get an idea from what we've talked about already, is that there's lots of people involved in this, and as projects lawyers, we can act for all of them. So the main three people that we will act for in all of this is the public sector, the person who needs the service, the project company, which is the special purpose vehicle that is pulled together by the equity investors, the contractors and the service providers, that enters into the contract with the public sector. We can act for the equity investors, the people that invest into the project company. We can act for the funders, the people that provide the project company the money to pay the contractor to build the asset. We can act for the contractor, the person who has to build the asset. And we can act for the service provider, the person who provides the services out of the asset. Those services are split into two broad categories: hard and soft facilities management. Hard facilities management are things that require works. So for example, mechanical and electrical engineering works, civil and structural and engineering works. Soft FM services or soft facility management services are janitorial services. It's cleaning, key holding, security, that sort of thing. Nothing that requires tools effectively. So that's the kind of broad range of the types of clients that we work for, and the sorts of clients that we work for at the moment at Brodies are set out on this slide. So we work for a number of local authorities like Aberdeen City Council, North Lanarkshire Council, Falkirk Council, Renfrewshire Council. That doesn't sound particularly sexy or corporate or exciting, but actually, if you think about what the public sector represents in Scotland, these are some of the biggest organisations in the country. In fact, they are the biggest organisations in the country. Glasgow City Council, Edinburgh City Council, Aberdeen to an extent, North Lanarkshire Council. The spend that these people have is absolutely ginormous, and they're huge organisations that look after every aspect of public life on our behalf. So acting for these people is actually acting at the heart of what people do in Scotland. We act for local authorities down south as well as over the Irish Sea, in the Southern Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and in Wales. And we also act for other types of clients who are not based in the UK, but may have an interest in projects in the UK. One of the big banks that funds projects in the UK generally is NordLB. One of the big equity investors is Dalmore Capital. Another big equity investor is Equitix. They have huge amounts of investor infrastructure funds that invest into projects. Aviva is another bank that's really active in the market. We also act for the private sector. So some of the biggest tier 1 contractors in the country work on this stuff. So if you think about your Balfour Beatties, your Galliford Try, Robertsons, Grahams, Multiplex, Lend-Lease, all of anybody that you can think of that builds large things is kind of in this market, and we act for them. We also act for a whole bunch of project companies, which are special purpose vehicles set up to deliver these projects on behalf of these other people. And one example on there, which we're sole advisor to, is Hub South East Scotland. So that gives you a kind of broad range of the sorts of people that we act for. There's quite a broad mix. What do we actually do? Sometimes that's difficult to really say in a sentence, but if you think about projects lawyers as being basically proper transactional commercial contracts lawyers with a very, very specific area of expertise, that is what we do. So if you're worried that you don't know anything about projects and therefore you can't get into projects, that's rubbish. You can. When you come out of law school, you have a certain amount of skills, and when you come out of a traineeship, you have a certain amount of skills. And the important thing to think about those skills is that they're entirely transferable. There is nothing really that you cannot transfer from one area of a law into another. I mean, there are some notable exceptions to that, for example, court work, but there are loads of transferable skills that you gain throughout your traineeship, throughout your law degree, that can be applied to a number of different types of law. And when you're thinking about what you want to do in the future, it's really useful to think about what are your best transferable skills and then apply them to a subject matter that you enjoy. I really like projects because it is right at the forefront of the interface between the public and the private sector. And we work on projects that everybody can look at, see and touch and experience. It's really politically sensitive, it's really cyclical, and it's really important for the country. These are projects of national significance. So I quite like applying my transferable skills to these projects. And when I was a trainee, I kind of broke that down into two broad categories. You're either a transactional lawyer or you're not a transactional lawyer. I find that I much prefer the cut and thrust of working on transactions, which are specific things that have a start, a middle and an end. So when I got my head into the fact that I wanted to be a transactional lawyer, I was thinking about what kind of transactional lawyer I wanted to be. The broadest kind of transactional lawyer you can be really is a corporate commercial lawyer, where you do either lots of corporate general work or a specific type of corporate work, or you do commercial contracts, which is basically just contracts for all sorts of services and things. We do commercial contracts in a very specific market, which is this world of public-private interface. And we've got a specific document that we use to do that, which is called a project agreement. And effectively what a project agreement is a mashup of three other agreements. It's an overarching agreement that deals with funding, construction and services. And what comes out of the bottom of a project agreement are a whole bunch of other agreements, like a construction contract, a service contract, a funding agreement, and all of the collateral documents that go around that. But in essence, our area of specialty is drafting this one single agreement called a project agreement. There's no magic to drafting a project agreement. We don't do it from scratch. They're based on standard form documentation, as you'll find a lot of construction contracts are. Very, very, very few, an infinitesimally small amount of construction contracts are drafted from scratch. They are normally based on industry standard form documents so that everybody knows what to expect. I'm using this standard form document. Do you want to contract with me? Yes or no? And then you tailor it to the specific needs of the client. We do that with project agreements on a daily basis. We also draft construction contracts. So we are construction lawyers, and 50% at least of a project agreement is a construction contract. So we need to know about construction. But we don't need specialist knowledge about construction because we have specialist construction teams that do that for us. What we do need to do is we need to apply our skills, our transferable skills, really practically to actual situations that occur in construction projects, programming, and project management. And that's the bit that I really, really like about it. We manage the transaction from start to finish. We manage input from all of the teams across the whole of the firm to end up with this one tangible thing that is delivered and then services are delivered out of. So we will manage teams from corporate, from real estate, from banking, from construction, probably IP, probably employment. If you think about what these assets involve when there are people working in them, you can get an idea of the sort of stretch and breadth of things that we would need to cover in a project agreement in order to make it work. Each of those things needs specialist input from specialist teams, and we pull it all together. We are at the front of the transaction and we lead and manage the transaction. If you think about these assets that we build as investment grade assets, then we can begin to understand that once something is built and running, it is a very secure source of income for an investor because hospitals stay open all the time, roads stay open all the time, and therefore services payments have to be made all the time in order to keep them open. And that's really attractive for investors with low appetite for risk. So there's a really big secondary market in projects where people buy and sell projects. And you get a whole crew of clients who are there, who have money to invest in secure assets, and they need lawyers to help them buy it in the same way that they need lawyers to help them buy companies. They need lawyers to help them buy projects. And that's where we come in. We help them do all of the diligence over the projects and report to them and help go through the purchase process. We're doing that currently for a French utility company who wants to buy a Scottish wastewater project. Let that flow through your heads for a moment. The most important skill that I think that projects lawyers have, because of our management requirements, because of our need to pull everything together, the most important skill that we have is an ability to talk to people, to figure out what's important, to figure out when it's important, where the problems are, how to solve the problems and get through the problems. And that all comes through talking. All of our negotiation is done on email and phone and in meetings. We do a lot of all of the legal stuff with the drafting and the technical skills. That all has to be there, and that all comes with practice. But one of the things that you need to be as a projects lawyer is a people person. You need to be able to bring together groups of people and make them deliver projects. And quite often under some quite significantly stressful time periods. I've given you the kind of soft answer to what a project is, and this is what a project is. And each line in here represents a contract in essence. And we as projects lawyers are responsible for oversight over all of this. So this is what we deliver on behalf of our clients. If we're acting for the authority, the main contract that we look at is the one between the authority and the private partner. That's called the project agreement. If we act for the private partner, the SPV, or the project co as it's sometimes known, we have to be on top of and across all of these agreements. So we need to know how the financing works, how the project agreement works, how the corporate equity investors are working, who the O&M contractors are. O&M is another word for facilities management. It's slightly different. It's operation and maintenance. We need to know about the construction contracting, and we need to know about everything in between. So there's a lot of moving parts that we pull together as part of our role as project managers on these jobs. We don't only do this for new buildings, we also do it for buildings and assets that are already running, because these things run for a long time. Quite often changes are required to them. We call that a variation. And when we do variations, we need to amend each one of these contracts to bring in what the changes are needed to each one of the contracts. So it might be a change of service provider halfway through the project. It might be the addition of an additional ward onto a hospital. It can be a number of different things. We're being instructed at the moment by Scottish Water to add some odour control units onto a sludge factory. That's the kind of breadth of sectors that we work across. I've put up here some example projects. So the one on the left there is the map for the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Road and the Balmedy-Tipperty link. When I was at Pinson's, we acted for the project company on this project, which was the second largest infrastructure project delivered in Scotland. The value of the project was 750 million quid, and it's now up and running. 750 million quid buys you 38 kilometres worth of road serviced for 25 years. So I've put that up because the next really big project to come through in Scotland will be the dualling of the A9. The dualling of the A9 is going to be one of the most complex roads projects attempted in the UK to date. If you know what the geography of the A9 is like, you can imagine how difficult it's going to be to do all the work along that route in the areas and in the weather that affects that route. That's being split into 3 bundles. The total value of the bundles at the moment is estimated to be in the region of £3 billion. So we're talking about 3 £1 billion bundles. The way that that is delivered effectively is that you get a construction contractor and an O&M contractor with an equity investor to come together with a funding package, and they bid through a procurement process called competitive dialogue. Scottish Transport Scotland is the procuring agency on behalf of Scottish ministers for roads projects in Scotland, and that will be delivered via a document that we're calling the Mutual Investment Model. The Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route was delivered through something called the NPD model, which is the non-profit distribution model. You'll find that projects lawyers are really keen on acronyms for absolutely everything. And the first thing that I got handed on my first day in a project seat at McGregor's in 2010 was a glossary of defined terms to look through. It takes a bit of getting used to, but you get there in the end. This building on the top right is the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital. You might have seen that in the press because there are and continue to be a number of problems with Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital. One of which was that the NHS couldn't accept completion of the building and provide services out of it because of a problem that they had created. And if you think about equity in contracting, which is a position that we need to think about quite a lot when we're project lawyers, what is the equitable position and what is the suitable allocation of risk for a project between the procuring authority and the project company? If the procuring authority is saying we can't accept the building because of something that we have done, and I won't get into the detail of that, it's subject to the public investigation at the moment on which I think we're acting. Public inquiry is the word I was looking for there. If you can't accept the building because of something that you've done, it's not the project company's fault, but project company still has to pay the loan back. And so you'll see that the press that covered Sick Kids was that the building was ready to go. The NHS couldn't accept it, but they had to pay for it as if they had accepted it. That is a really good example of projects law coming into mainstream press. If you look that up afterwards, you can see quite the uproar that was caused by that, because the services fee for these types of facilities is not small. It's in the millions per month. So what we had was a situation, the NHS board, in this instance, NHS Lothian, paying out hundreds of thousands of pounds a week for a facility that they could not use. The one below that is obviously Edinburgh Trams. Edinburgh Trams was not procured on the basis of a PPP structure, but it is a massive infrastructure project in the country on which Brodies is acting on behalf of the contractor. And that's the interface that projects lawyers have with construction teams. Construction teams, when they're working in these sectors, particularly in these large infrastructure projects, need to understand how infrastructure projects are pulled together. And so we work very closely with the construction team, the non-contentious construction team and the contentious construction team, to give them advice about how the project works and what sorts of things they need to be looking for that aren't pure construction issues. I've included the Queensferry crossing as well because That is the largest infrastructure project that's ever been delivered in Scotland. That was £1.5 billion worth. It was delivered on a design and build basis, not on a PPP basis. But again, we have input into issues surrounding the Queensferry crossing because of its project type structure and because of our knowledge and understanding of how these contractors work. I think those are 4 of the biggest projects that have happened in Scotland in recent times. So junior team members, what do you guys get up to? In projects, it's very similar to any other transactional commercial contract seat. But with us, and particularly for the person that fills the new NQ role, there will be a real opportunity for you to get going and get a real solid understanding of what we do very quickly, because we're working a lot on a particular type of project at the moment called a design and build development agreement, which is like a mini project. And these are for small scale school buildings, basically, that don't have a services period afterwards, but do have a project agreement and a construction contract and all of the ancillary documents around it. So junior team members at the moment will be very quickly drafting and leading on project managing those types of projects. And the brilliant thing about that is when you've learned how to do it on a small scale, the skills are exactly the same. It doesn't matter what the magnitude of spend is. The skills are the same. When things become more expensive, they become more complex. That's the nature of things. But when you learn how to do it on the small things, you can apply that to the big things. And what you will be drafting are key ancillary documents. And by drafting, I do not mean starting from a blank screen and typing in the names of the parties. I mean tailoring documents, precedent documents that we know work and that are agreed between the parties to fit project-specific circumstances. That's what I mean by drafting bespoke amendments to contracts. I might say, put a clause in here that does X, Y, and Z, and you will go away and draft that clause. I will look at it, and then we will send it out to the clients to check. You will be negotiating contracts, by which I mean the smaller contracts on a project, but still the contracts that are needed for a project. That might be warranties or parent company guarantees, these sorts of things. And by negotiation, I mean email negotiation, telephone negotiation, and eventually we get to the point where we attend meetings and we have a big Barney and everybody shouts about the bits that they don't agree about and the bits that they do agree about, and we try and get to the point of resolution, and it's all very collegiate and gentlemanly, obviously. A big part of a role for a junior team member in our team is key document management. There's a huge amount of admin needed to make sure these projects run efficiently, on time, on budget, and are delivered at the right time. And junior team members are really, really, really key to that because they have the oversight over everything. They're normally the ones that all of the stuff from all of the other teams come into, and they're responsible for synthesizing that information, organizing it, and making sure everybody knows what everybody needs to do and when they need to do it. So that's all that liaising with other teams to collate inputs and advice. And there's bits of research to do, as there are in any role. We don't do very much law in projects. We just don't. And when law points come up, we have to think about them because they're usually very unique. We usually take specialist input on that, and the junior team member will be the person who's the point person on that, finding out how to fix the issue and moving on. I thought it'd be helpful just quickly to go through a quick case study. We were instructed by our client Hub South East Scotland in November in 2020 on the announcement of the rollout of the vaccination programme in Scotland. Their client, NHS Lothian, was tasked by Nicola Sturgeon to get vaccination centres up and running to hit the ground by the end of January, sometime in the middle of November. The thing about projects work is that these are not nimble animals. These are large tankers that take a while to turn around. From start to finish on a project, we would normally be talking about 1 to 3 years if we are going from procurement all the way through to signing contracts. You might be working on a project for between 1 and 3 years. That is a long time. These are big beasts. Our sweet spot in terms of cash for these projects is around 200 to 300 million pounds or euros. They take a long time to get off the ground and they take a long time to finalise. when we get an instruction from somebody that says this needs to be done by Christmas, it's quite unusual for us. We normally are able to program our cycle quite clearly because we work in all these different sectors. We know when the sectors are likely to do things. For example, schools all need to be open on the second week in August. So we can work back from that, an 18-month program, to know when the construction contract needs to be signed. And we can work back from that another 6 months to know when we have to start the legal work stream. And we can build that all up quite nicely. When someone says in November, this needs done by the end of December, we get a little bit excited. And I mentioned earlier that we work purely on standard form documentation. And in the hub world, we work in a standard form document called the Design and Build Development Agreement, which is basically a project agreement that says, you, Mr. Private Sector, will build me a thing for a certain amount of money and you will do it on a certain day. And that is fine for a school, but for this project, we didn't have any detail at all about what it was that we needed to deliver, but we knew when we had to deliver it. So NHS Lothian got told by Nicola Sturgeon, deliver this by the end of January, but nobody knew what it had to look like. But we had to get into contract in order to pay everybody to design it. So we had to come up with some very specific tailored drafting to completely amend the risk profile in this standard form documentation, because we didn't have a price, we didn't have a program, and we didn't have a design, and we actually didn't know where they were going to be when we started drafting the documents. If any of you are in Edinburgh, you'll know that there were 3 eventual sites chosen. One of them is shown on the screen there, that's the EICC, the other one's at the Pyramids, and the other one's at QMU, I think. But there was a whole bunch of other sites in the mix at the start of the conversation on this, and we had to keep drafting for all of these different sites until the NHS and Hub managed to lock down commercially where they were going to be able to put the vaccination centres. And if you think about what we normally do with these project agreements, is we build an asset, but in the case of a vaccination centre, we were building temporary structures. Effectively, we went to marquee people and said, can you build marquees that are suitable for clinical settings? That's a really, really complex thing to do very, very quickly. And the guys at Hub and the NHS were absolutely outstanding at getting it done. And we were effectively tasked with sweeping up in the background and making sure that the construction contract reflected how this was going to be paid for, when we didn't know what it was going to look like and we didn't know how much it was going to cost. And we did that on what we call a cost plus basis. So normally a contractor will tender for a job and say, I'll do this for £1 million. I know what you want, I'll give you that for £1 million, just as an example. In this instance, we had to say, whatever you decide you want, we will charge you how much that costs us to build it, plus a margin. So that's called cost plus. That's really unusual in the public sector for a cost plus project, because the public sector is under a duty at all times to provide value for money, and it cannot, in essence, provide value for money or be audited to provide value for money unless it has interrogated costs. And it cannot interrogate costs if it's just getting a bill every month for what the contractor thinks is needed. But the procurement element of all of this is that the procurement regulations allow things to happen in emergencies. And you'll see that there's lots of stuff in the press about that when you think about the VIP lanes for all of the PPE equipment that the government bought during the COVID pandemic. They did that all on the basis of it being required in an emergency, and therefore it wasn't properly regulated. And there's a lot of problems coming out of that now. What we did in this instance was look at the procurement guidance and say, we can do this. We can contract on the basis of standard form documentation tailored specifically for this reason, with a cost plus pricing mechanic set out in it, because it's an emergency. And we had to do it quickly, and we had to deliver it at the end of January. And what we ended up doing was delivering the construction contract at the end of January to allow the guys to get on the park and start putting together these vaccination centres. And then we had the period of the construction programme to agree, finalise and sign the services contract, because all of these vaccination centres needed to be serviced, and some of them had to be serviced in a clinical setting, which is a particularly high bar for cleanliness, as you can imagine. So what we ended up with was something that worked, something that was delivered on time, and something which we think provided value for money for the NHS. And we've ended up varying it 4 times now to deal with the ongoing vaccination rollout that goes out throughout the country. And the last thing that we're going to have to do is take it all down. And normally these projects don't allow for taking down, they only allow for putting up. So we're going to vary it in the coming weeks to start taking the things down because the vaccination rollout is now gone. There's a question in here about the greater focus on net zero, which is really interesting. I delivered a presentation recently alongside the Transport Minister for Scotland talking about the net zero agenda. The Scottish Futures Trust has done a lot on net zero, particularly in the infrastructure sector. And part of the driver for that is this understanding that the infrastructure that we need in 30 years has largely already been built. If you break that down, we don't have much time left, but if we think about that in real terms, it's not carbon neutral to build buildings and build roads all the time. What is much more within the net zero agenda is refurbish and reuse. It's basically recycling infrastructure assets. And what we need to think about in the infrastructure sector is how we retrofit carbon neutral buildings into assets that already exist. You can't do that with a road. And one of the big things that happened recently was that the A96, which is the road between Inverness and Aberdeen, which was expected to be dualled in the same way that the A9 is going to be dualled, was canned. And we think it was canned primarily as a result of the partnership between the Greens and SNP. We think that might have been a deal breaker for the Greens. We can't be part of the administration if the administration is building loads of roads that have loads of carbon guzzling vehicles on it, so please get rid of the A96. And they found a reason to get rid of it. What we're focusing on a lot in infrastructure is how we develop and apply and retrofit smart infrastructure into existing assets. Smart infrastructure is a really, really fascinating area where we talk about things like digital twinning, where we create a digital twin of an asset and run that from a desktop in the most efficient way possible using AI, which then goes into the building and runs the building. And the bits of the building that we're talking about running are things like heating and ventilation, mechanical systems, boilers, swimming pools, lighting. If you look at New Capital Square office, for example, it's got LED automatic lighting. That is an example of something that is now going into loads of the originally built NPD schools projects. So I'm currently working on an LED retrofit for all of Falkirk Council's schools. That's a good example of how we're focusing on carbon neutrality and infrastructure going forward. There's another couple of questions in here. I think we've covered what I enjoy most about working in projects, which you probably have noticed because I've taken up all of the time now talking. I get to talk a lot to a lot of people about a lot of things and solve problems and think practically and apply my experience to practical situations. And that's it in a nutshell. I love the practicality of it all. Someone says, here is my problem. I say, let's have a think about how we can fix it. And I love getting my head into all the detail about all the technical elements of it. To give you an idea of the spread of the sectors that we work in education, health, student accommodation, waste, and waste, I mean residual waste like black bin bag waste, energy from waste. We work in wastewater. And if you think about the different skill sets that you might need to work in wastewater compared to working in building boxes that classrooms are in, they're really disparate. And you kind of have to get your head into the different worlds and the different sectors and understand how they work. I didn't think I'd ever need a biology degree to work in infrastructure projects, but when you work in wastewater, you need to kind of get a little bit about how all the chemicals work that treat the water so that you can understand what processes you need to legislate for in the documents. So I enjoy the really broad scope of all of the bits and pieces that we work on, but ultimately I just love chatting away to people about it and fixing their problems. And then there's a huge feeling of satisfaction when you get to the end of these things, sign the documents and everybody gets a public asset out of it. It's great fun. I think I've taken up all the time. You're really welcome to get in touch with me. My email address is there, my phone number is there.